We are on the home stretch of this study. Week 11, there are only 13 weeks in the study, so after today, only 2 weeks left in this book. And I will say that chapter 11 was not much easier to wrap your head around than chapter 10, because he's essentially on the same theme but broadening it out. Because last week it was a substantial healing of psychological problems. And today it's substantial healing of the total person. Indeed, he is talking about how we become whole people. We have so many things about us that can become fragmented. So many places we can be broken. How do we bring it all together into the whole person we were created to be? But I figure it's best to define some terms right from the outset. And that is what Schaeffer starts with, where he says, I used the word substantial in the last chapter, and he wants to define what that does and what that does not mean. The first thing is, you know, what is possible for you within God's present purpose for you? And that may not align with what you want, with your ideals. He uses Lazarus as an example, right? Raised from the dead, but by no means immune to further ailments or even to another experience of death. And I was thinking, as I was reading through that, of that man in the country of the Gerasenes, whose real name we never learn. He was so fragmented, so separated from himself, that when asked what his name was, he said Legion, because he had many demons in him. Now, you remember what happened to him, right? He was psychologically healed. And also, there was, I expect, following after that, a considerable physical healing, because in his brokenness, he would cut himself, he would wound himself. But after he was healed, he says he begged that he might go with Jesus. And to this, Jesus said no. Instead, he sent him back to those who had only known him for many years as a demon possessed freak, in order to testify to what God has done. Now, if he had been of a mind, now that he had his mind back, to say, well, that wasn't the plan I had in mind, I'm going with you anyway, we would have had a very different story. But no, we have a story that finishes. The man went away proclaiming throughout the whole city how much Jesus had done for him. So that the next time Jesus is in the area, he gets quite a different reaction. Of course, this first time, they're so absolutely frightened out of their wits that they ask him to leave. Like, please go. We don't want you around here. Weird things happen when you're here. But he does come back. People listen to him. But what Schaeffer points out is quite true. A lot of times we petition to God for things with a thought in mind of what we deem to be the perfect outcome. But things will not and are not guaranteed to be made perfect until all things are made new. And Schaeffer refers to it as our conceit, our old longing to be God, that can cause us to insist that everything bend to the standards that I have set. You'll probably recognize this most clearly in the times when people say, God didn't answer my prayer, when more accurately they should be saying, God did not give me what I wanted. He didn't do what I told him to do. Or even simply, God said no. And Schaeffer does point out, right, and we know this from experience, that if we seek the perfect ideal instead of accepting the struggle, then we lose what we could have in the pursuit of what's impossible. He talks about marriages, where they enter into marriage with this high ideal of what the marriage relationship does for you. I can help but think of a certain movie from the late 90s where the tag, basically the climax, the confession was, you complete me. But no human being can ever complete another. You may think, right, that I will be a complete person if I marry. And all the people who've been married for years just kind of snigger and say, you'll learn. Or you might think, you know, my life would be complete as soon as I have kids. You're like, no, your life gets more complicated when you have kids. All sorts of things that we say to ourselves. Well, if I had this, if I were that, I would be a complete person. I would be whole. I would be totally happy and at peace. And yeah, this is where we start talking about defining the term of what do we mean total person? That's the name of the chapter, after all, substantial healing of the total person. But what do we mean by that? And we talked about last week how a human being is composed of many elements. We have the physical and we have the spiritual. The spiritual is composed of the rational, right? The intellect, the ability to think, and the emotional, our feelings, and the volitional, our will, our choices, our decisions. And one thing, Schaeffer uses the analogy of overinflating a tire. He says it's the point of weakness may emerge anywhere. But the pressure that causes the break is that of, I quote, needing to be the integration point of all things, because we are not willing to be the creatures we are. See, underlying his entire argument here is there is only one true point of completion, which we'll get to defining that term, but he uses the phrase integration point. There is only one of these things, and it's not a thing, it's a person, it's God. God is the only one who can make us complete. But what we tend to fall into, that old longing to be God, as Schaeffer puts it, is demanding that we determine and create our own wholeness, our own unity of person. But that's not what we were created to be. So you talk about integration. You look it up in the dictionary. Merriam-Webster is very helpful to say it's to form, coordinate, or blend into a functioning or unified whole, to unite. That, of course, made me think of the Hebrew shalom, which is translated simply as peace, but peace composed of a completeness, wholeness, soundness. And of course, Schaeffer uses integration point to refer to that which makes us complete or addresses every part of us. I had to smile. I love his analogy. It's just the funniest one I've come across so far in this book, of stuffing a man into a garbage can. It's page 128 if you're using this copy of it. And it just, oh, it cracks me up. When he talks about false integration points, all those things that we try to use in place of God to make ourselves complete. And he says, false integration points may seem satisfactory only to end in that which is insufficient, with bits and pieces of the total man left out. I picture false integration points as being like a garbage can into which we may try to push a man, but it's not big enough. So we jam him down, but his head sticks out. So we lift him out and we jam him down again in a different way, but this time his legs stick out. And so we lift him up and jam him down again. But now his arm sticks out. We never get the whole man in. You think about these things. You have to take a moment, right? You think about all the things that people try to use to bring completion to their lives. All the substitutes for genuine wholeness. Possessions, sexual activity, relationships, food, achievements, social acceptance. The list goes on and on. And none of them stand very close scrutiny. Because as soon as you think about it, you realize that each one of these things may address one part of you for a temporary period of time. But none of them address all of you all of the time. What they do instead is something quite different and something entirely negative in the end. It made me think of Paul's discussion in 1 Corinthians 6. He's talking about how they have grievances. There's sexual immorality among them. All sorts of things are happening, practices that are not good for them. And he addresses, go to verse 12 and onward, he addresses these sort of proverbial sayings that they've got. All things are lawful for me. And he says, yeah, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be enslaved by anything. Food is meant for the stomach and the stomach for food. Yeah, and God will destroy both one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality. Substitute there, in your mind, any of these other things that we use as substitutes for genuine wholeness. Now, he uses right here sexual immorality because that one is the most intimately destroying of false integration points. But all of them come to this point. The body is not meant for that, but for the Lord, and the Lord from the body. And he finishes this argument. He says, you are not your own. You don't have that power to decide what makes you whole, what should be done with yourself. You were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. And when you hit this point, right, you ask yourself, what I try to use to complete myself, has that turned into something that controls me? And oftentimes the answer is yes. I've tried to apply this as a patch. What it's done is it has entangled me, it has bound me. When he talks about, I will not be enslaved by anything in verse 12, he's using, and some translations will say dominated, right? He's using a Greek word that means to exercise authority, to have power over, to control. And his point is, who or what is allowed to have power over a believer? When you put it in those terms, the answer is really obvious. But that's only if you think about it, right? If you are exercising your rational capacities as a creature made in the image of God. And a lot of times, people just don't do that. They act on reflex, they act on emotion. And they don't think through the price of this the price of the substitute. What will it cost you in the end? But in reality, right, what was it that Jesus said? No one can serve two masters. This is said twice in the Gospels. Matthew has it in the Sermon on the Mount. Luke places it, and I'm going to refer to Luke just because it's in an interesting context. He places it after the parable of the dishonest steward. Luke 16. After he talks about this parable, the rich man had a manager, right? And charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And so he says, what's this I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management. You can no longer be manager. And so the manager sits down and says, well, what am I going to do? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm too proud to beg. So here's what I'm going to do. So he goes to the debtors of his master, and he cuts their bills. I'm not going to talk about why he did this or whether this is, him just removing his own commission, we say, from this, or whether he is actually just trying to get some fast money for his master. But it says, people of this world are more shrewd in their dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. So make friends for yourself. And this is, I'm sure if you've been in scripture at all, you know this story and you know where it ends. But here's how he wraps it up. And it's very likely that he puts this in here because of who's listening to him. No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. And the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things and they ridiculed him. Like, you can almost hear them say, well, you only say that because you don't have any money. Sort of a sour grapes thing. He says, you're those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. And what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. So go back to that phrase, you cannot serve God and money. And substitute money for any of these other things that people use to try to find wholeness for themselves. You cannot serve God and relationships. You can't serve God and sex. You can't serve God and food. You can't serve God and achievement. Plug in your favorite vice. You cannot serve God and this other thing. And that's not all. Hop over to 2 Peter chapter 2. Tied up with the ideas that Paul is addressing in 1 Corinthians, that idea that, oh, I'm in Christ now, all things are permissible for me. And he, talking about false teachers rising up, exploiting the church, condemned from long since, here's how he describes them as human beings. They are waterless springs, mists driven by a storm. For them, the gloom of utter darkness has been reserved, for Speaking loud boasts of folly, they entice by sensual passions of the flesh those who are barely escaping from those who live in error. They promise them freedom, but they themselves are slaves of corruption. And here's the principle involved: for whatever overcomes a person, to that he is enslaved. And here, right, when he talks about overcomes, that's a word that refers to defeat in war, to being conquered and therefore being proved inferior to whatever conquered you. But what were we made to be? He's talked about this in more than one chapter, about how we were created uniquely in God's image. We are not God. We cannot be God. And yet we are not animal. We are this overlapping circle in the Venn diagram of creation that has the rationality, the personality of from God as his image without his infinity. And that distinguishes us from mere animals. When Schaeffer talks about that sort of Pavlovian reflex, a lot of people talk about things like we've talked about here with the false integration points, as if they are uncontrollable reflexes. And Schaeffer's like, no, not a bit of it. You possess rationality to think things through. You may choose not to use it, but you still possess it. We are not enslaved to our reflexes. At least we should not be. What should we be then? We've spent a lot of time talking about all of these false integration points and how nothing is sufficient to bring us into a wholeness, that total person we were created to be. And there we have the key word. We were created. And Schaeffer talks very vehemently, really, about having that proper relationship of creature to creator and redeemed to redeemer. And what brings us real integration, real unity of person, what encompasses all of us is nothing more than that which is bigger than us, which knows us better than we know ourselves. And here's how he describes it. He calls it thinking after and willing after God. To think after God as he has revealed himself in his creation, and especially as he has revealed himself in the Bible, is, says Schaeffer, to have an integrated answer to life, both intellectually, in theory, and in practice. And that is where we find our wholeness. But we find more than that. He ends the chapter talking about communion with God. Because a lot of times we get stuck into that insistence that everything bend to the standards that I have set, that everything happen as I want it to happen, because I know best for myself. We fall into that because we forget who God really is. Or we develop a habit of thinking that he's something he's not. And toward the end of the chapter, Schaefer's like, we are often, I said, we would be less than truthful, I think, if we failed to acknowledge that often we're afraid to offer ourselves for God's use for fear of what will come. Have you ever had that kind of moment where you find yourself praying something and then you're like, oh, but what if God does this with this prayer? And out of fear, you start backpedaling or you start trying to explain. No, what I really mean is, I want you to do this. But fear, he says, falls to the ground when we see before whom we're standing. We are standing in a living relationship with a living God who loves us and has shown his love for us to such an extent that Jesus died on the cross. Fear falls, and we have the courage to give ourselves for his use without being afraid. When we see we are not giving ourselves in the teeth of an impersonal situation or of a world that hates us or an inhuman world of men, we are offering ourselves before the God who loves us, and he is not a monster, but our Heavenly Father. This one true integration point of ourselves brings us into genuine communion with God, because we place ourselves back in our rightful place in the universe, and we fulfill our designated purpose. Creature to creator, redeemed to redeemer. And therein do we find completion and peace. And the world will notice. That's where we go with next week's chapter, healing in personal relationships. You'll get a lot of advice about how to relate to other people, but to be honest, one of the things you'll find is that until you are in right relationship with God, your efforts to be in right relationship with people will always be strained. But once you acknowledge who you are before God, then it becomes possible to obey that second commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself. We'll talk about that next week.